There are places on our planet that don't want us there. They are actively trying to kill us from the moment we arrive. And the most hostile of them all is the great white continent at the bottom of the world, Antarctica. 100 years ago, it was the last great prize in the age of exploration, a race to stand at the geographic South Pole. This man, Captain Robert Falcon Scott of the Royal Navy, would become the most famous person in that race. His failure and his death would make him a national hero, a martyr for the British Empire. But the truth is, his fate wasn't sealed in the final, desperate blizzard. He had already lost the race before he even began the final push. This is Captain Robert Falcon Scott. A career Royal Navy officer, he was the embodiment of the British Empire at its peak. Stoic, brave, and driven by a powerful sense of duty and national honor. After a first, moderately successful trip to Antarctica on the Discovery Expedition, he was chosen to lead the much larger, more ambitious Terra Nova Expedition. The goal was singular and immense, to be the first human beings to stand at the geographic South Pole and claim it for Britain. It was more than just a journey, it was a matter of national prestige. Scott assembled a huge team focused not just on the pole, but on an extensive program of scientific research, geology, biology, and meteorology. It was a massive, state-funded undertaking. But as Scott was preparing in Australia, he received a telegram that changed everything. A simple, almost curt message from another explorer. Beg leave to inform you proceeding Antarctic. The sender was the Norwegian, Roald Amundsen. Scott and the world had assumed Amundsen was heading for the North Pole. It was a stunning deception. What had been a scientific expedition was now a brutal, head-to-head race. To understand Scott's failure, you must first understand the man who beat him. Roald Amundsen was everything Scott was not. He was not a naval officer in a grand hierarchy. He was a polar professional, a pragmatist. He had learned from the Inuit how to survive and thrive in the extreme cold. His goal was not science or glory. It was the pole, and only the pole. His expedition was small, lean, special forces unit compared to Scott's large conventional army. Amundsen's planning was meticulous and ruthlessly efficient. He chose a different landing spot, the Bay of Whales, which put him 60 nautical miles closer to the pole. His equipment, his food, his clothing, everything was designed for speed and efficiency. And most importantly, he built his entire plan around a single, proven method of polar transport, one that Scott tragically misunderstood. It's hard to overstate what was at stake here. This was the tail end of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The map of the world was almost entirely filled in. This was the last great blank space, the last continent to be conquered. To be the first to stand at its heart was to secure a form of immortality, both for the man and his nation. Scott carried the weight of the entire British Empire on his shoulders. So how did Scott lose? The answer lies in 3 critical and ultimately fatal mistakes made long before the final march. Mistake number 1, a failure of transport. Scott, a man of the industrial British Empire, put his faith in new technology, 3 experimental motor sledges. They were a disaster, sputtering and failing in the extreme cold within days of leaving base camp. His backup was Siberian ponies. Scott believed they were better suited for the task than dogs. He was unfortunately wrong. The ponies' hooves sank deep into the soft snow, which exhausted them. They sweat, which froze in their harnesses and rubbed their skin raw. They couldn't cope with the conditions and had to be shot for food far earlier than planned, leaving the men to the most brutal work of all, man-hauling. Scott romanticized it as a display of British grit and the spirit of the game. Amundsen called it madness. It was an incredibly inefficient and exhausting way to travel, burning thousands of precious calories a day. While Amundsen's dogs did the work, Scott's men became the beasts of burden. Mistake number 2, a failure of logistics. Amundsen meticulously laid 10 massive caches of food and fuel along his route, marked by a line of black flags so they were impossible to miss. Scott's depots were smaller, contained less fuel, and were spaced further apart. Critically, his final and largest depot, the 1-ton depot, was laid over 30 miles north of its planned location due to poor weather. A 30-mile gap that would later become a death sentence. Mistake number 3, a failure of command. At the last possible moment on the final push to the pole, Scott made a baffling decision. The plan had always been for a team of 4 to make the final run, but Scott pointed to a 5th man, Henry Birdie Bowers, and said, "You are to go on with the pole party." The sledges, skis, tent space, and rations were all packed and prepared for 4. The addition of a 5th man threw the delicate calculations into chaos. They were slower, colder, and hungrier from day 1 of the final push. On January 17th, 1912, they reached the pole, and there they found it, the Norwegian flag, a tent, and a letter from Amundsen. They were 34 days too late. The psychological blow was catastrophic. Scott wrote in his diary, "The pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." Now they had to turn around, a 900-mile journey back with dwindling supplies, failing bodies, and crushed spirits. One man, Edgar Evans, died after a fall. Then Lawrence Titus Oates, his feet crippled with frostbite, famously walked out of a tent into a blizzard, saying, "I'm just going outside and maybe sometime." It was a heroic suicide, an attempt to save the others. It was, unfortunately, in vain. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers were trapped by a blizzard just 11 miles from the 1-ton depot, a depot that was 30 miles short of where it should have been. There, they died. Their bodies were discovered 8 months later, along with Scott's journals. When the news reached the world, the tragedy and the eloquence of his final words transformed Scott from a failure into a martyr. For decades, Scott was the hero. History is a complex thing. Modern analysis has rightfully highlighted the poor planning that doomed the expedition. But that doesn't diminish their courage. Scott's story is the ultimate reminder that for every clean victory, there's a story of glorious, tragic failure. A story that sometimes captures our hearts even more. A story of a man whose only mistake was being second. History remembers the winners. We remember the rest. Subscribe for more of the stories you were never told.